For 132 years, the Cliff Haven Lighthouse had stood like a spine against the sea. Its beams swept across the Atlantic every night without fail, a rhythm so dependable the people of Ardbridge stopped noticing it altogether. Until one December night in 1998, when the light went dark. It was just past 2 a.m. when the beam failed. The coast was blanketed in fog, with a low-pressure front rolling in from the northeast. Locals said the wind that night came in strange pulses, not constant, but like it was breathing. Several trawlers returning to the harbor noticed it first. The sea was rough, the cliff faces slick with mist, and the lighthouse, normally a lifeline, was pitch black. Calls were made, radios crackled with concern, and by dawn, the town's uneasy silence had hardened into something else, confusion. The caretaker assigned to the lighthouse was Raymond Dalka, 54, lived alone, retired from the merchant navy, known for his strict adherence to routines and protocols, meals at the same time every day, detailed weather logs, maintenance checklists taped neatly above his tool bench. Locals often said Raymond was less of a man and more of a machine. You'd see him walking into town once every 2 weeks, same coat, same pace, buying the same 2 tins of beans and a pack of matches. He barely spoke, never smiled. But everyone agreed, if there was one man you could trust to keep the light burning, it was him. When the Coast Guard reached Cliff Haven later that morning, what they found didn't make sense. The door was locked from the inside, bolted, not latched, and the key was still in the interior slot. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. The main lamp housing was intact, and the backup generators hadn't tripped. It was as if someone had simply turned it off. They breached the door with a crowbar. Inside, everything was in place. Raymond's boots were by the base of the stairwell. A kettle sat half-filled on the stove. A chair was pulled out at the small writing desk, where his logbook rested open to a blank page dated December 4th. The page before it ended mid-sentence. Barometer drop at 11:42 p.m. Wind gusts suggest, and then nothing. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no misplaced tools, no spilled tea. The bed was made, the oil stores full, the coat he always wore hung neatly by the door. His emergency flare kit, rain gear, and satchel were untouched. There were no footprints outside, except for the officer's own. The stone path down to the shoreline was slippery but walkable, and the rope railings showed no signs of recent use. It was as if Raymond had simply vanished. Sheriff Holden Mathers, who'd known Raymond since the early 80s, said later that the strangeness of the scene wasn't in what they found. It was in what they didn't. If a man's running, he leaves marks. If a man falls, he leaves a dent. But this was still, too still, like someone pressed pause on his life. Speculation came fast. Maybe Raymond had slipped during maintenance and fallen into the ocean, but the winds hadn't peaked until after midnight, and the lamp was noted as operational at 12:06 a.m. A fall would have triggered the backup lantern. It didn't. Maybe he had a mental break, wandered off into the sea. But there was no history of instability, and nothing about the scene suggested haste or disarray. Maybe he faked his disappearance, but why leave everything behind, including the one item he never parted with, his father's pocket compass, still sitting on the desk? The Coast Guard launched a 48-hour shoreline search. Divers were dispatched, dogs were brought in, but they found nothing. No trail, nobody, no personal effects, and no answers. By the third day, the weather had turned. Sleet covered the cliffs and visibility dropped. The search was officially called off on the morning of December 9th. A local news anchor summarized it best: "The sea took him, or something else did." For weeks afterward, townsfolk left candles outside their doors at night, a quiet tribute to the man who had once lit the sea for them. But unease lingered. Cliff Haven was closed to the public pending investigation, and Raymond Dalka's name was added to the National Missing Persons Registry. No next of kin ever came forward. No funeral was held. And yet, something about that lighthouse, locked from the inside, silent, untouched, never sat right with the people of Ardbridge. There was a heaviness to it now. Fishermen stopped using the cove beneath it. Children dared each other to throw stones toward its base. And when the fog rolled in thicker than usual, folks crossed themselves without realizing it. Because the light hadn't just gone dark that night. Something else had gone quiet too. And 25 years later, it still hadn't made a sound. By the second day, the inside of the lighthouse became the center of everything. Every creaking floorboard, every speck of dust, every object left behind was studied like it held an answer. But none of it made sense. The kettle on the stove had water in it, cold now, but the bottom was still faintly stained with heat. The pantry was stocked, nothing missing, nothing disturbed. On the desk beside the open journal, a spoon lay across a saucer, resting in the exact position Raymond always left it. It was as if he had simply stood up in the middle of making tea and never came back. The only journal entry from that night ended without punctuation. Barometer drops at 11:42 p.m. Wind gusts suggest, and then silence. No blot of ink. No indication of what came next. Just the blank margin and the narrowing suspicion that something had interrupted him before he could finish the line. Investigators from the sheriff's office, the Coast Guard, and the Department of Marine Safety took turns combing through the structure. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry. The single access door to the lighthouse had been deadbolted from the inside. The window latches, old and rusted, were all still engaged. The spiral staircase which led from the base to the lantern chamber at the top had no evidence of distress, no scuff marks, no blood, no damage. The oil lamp was clean and intact. All equipment was accounted for. The living quarters, sparse but orderly, were just as pristine. Raymond's boots were placed neatly side by the coat rack. His navy peacoat still hung above them. A book of crossword puzzles sat on the nightstand, half filled, with a pencil resting in the spine. The bed was made. Even the waste bin was empty, save for one folded grocery receipt from 4 days earlier. The only thing missing was Raymond himself. Sheriff Mathers spent nearly 3 hours inside that day, walking from room to room in silence. He later told local reporters that it felt less like a crime scene and more like stepping into a paused life, as though time had simply stopped in Raymond's presence and forgotten to start again. A full-scale search of the coastline was launched within hours. Volunteers from Ardbridge joined trained responders, canvassing the rocky beaches, shallow inlets, and crumbling trails that stretched for miles in both directions. Divers entered the frigid waters beneath the cliffs, checking for signs of a body, a coat, a shoe, anything. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They caught no scent. The press began circling. Headlines painted the story in conflicting strokes. Storm claims keeper, vanishing at Cliff Haven, and lighthouse mystery deepens. Some suggested Raymond had taken his own life. Others hinted at an accident. Maybe he fell while inspecting the catwalk or slipped into the sea during the storm. But no one could explain why the door had been locked from the inside, why the storm lamp hadn't been activated, why no distress flare had been fired. One theory suggested that maybe Raymond had suffered a stroke or heart attack and wandered out in a daze. But autopsy results required a body, and there wasn't one. Another proposed that someone had managed to sneak into the lighthouse during the storm and taken him, but that raised its own impossible questions. How would they have gotten in, and how would they have left without leaving a single trace behind? His psychological history was clean. No medications, no erratic behavior. He hadn't expressed fear, depression, or paranoia to anyone in town. His bank account was untouched. No recent purchases, no hidden debts. He hadn't written or received a letter in over 2 years. His world was small, simple, structured, and it had vanished with him. The longer the case remained open, the more strange details began to surface. One of the volunteer searchers, a local named Arnie Porter, swore he'd seen a thin figure standing on the outer gallery of the lantern room during the first night of the storm, long after the light went out. He said it didn't look like Raymond. It looked taller. But by the time authorities reached the tower, the gallery was empty and no footprints were found. Rumors began swirling in town. Some said Raymond had gone mad from isolation and sealed himself away. Others believed he'd been followed, that someone from his past had come looking for him. And then there were the quieter whispers, the ones passed between fishermen and old-timers at the dock, that the lighthouse had always carried something with it. Something is wrong. But Sheriff Mathers didn't entertain folklore. He worked the case for 6 months, brought in specialists, filed requests for aerial footage, spoke with engineers, sleep disorder experts, even missing person psychologists. He never publicly admitted it, but in his final report, one line stood out. The evidence suggests a controlled environment with no external breach. Conclusion remains undetermined. There was no next of kin to notify. Raymond had no children, no siblings, no partner. The apartment he rented in Ardbridge was cleared out by the town. His belongings were boxed and stored. The lighthouse remained vacant. But what haunted investigators most wasn't just the absence of clues. It was the precision of it all, the locked door, the untouched food, the kettle cooling. It didn't feel like chaos, it felt arranged. And as the town slowly returned to normal, one question hung in the air like salt off the waves. If Raymond didn't leave through the door and no one came in, then where did he go? For weeks after Raymond Dalka's disappearance, the Cliffhaven Lighthouse remained shuttered. The door was resecured, the investigation officially paused, but no one in Ardbridge considered it over. Something about the way the light had failed, quietly, without violence, stuck with people. They'd seen boats lost to weather, fishermen dragged out by current. This felt different. It felt personal. And as the town searched for explanations, their attention turned to what the storm had left behind, or more accurately, what it hadn't. The official weather report from December 4th, 1998, recorded a sudden drop in barometric pressure around 11:38 p.m. Wind gusts climbed quickly to over 50 knots, but peaked for only a brief window, about 13 minutes. Rain had started earlier that evening, but never turned severe. There were no downed trees, no flooding, no damage to buildings. Cliffhaven itself, perched on exposed rock, should have shown signs of impact. But when investigators entered, nothing was cracked or soaked or shifted. The glass panes in the lantern room hadn't even fogged over. That discrepancy raised eyebrows at the Department of Marine Safety. Every major coastal weather event typically left behind a kind of fingerprint. This storm hadn't. On December 29th, Sheriff Mathers received a report from a junior technician at the Coastal Monitoring Station, 6 miles south of the lighthouse. The technician, Lucas Bain, was responsible for managing wind and acoustic sensors positioned on high-risk cliffs. That night, he had been monitoring the radio logs when he heard something strange come through one of the less-used channels, something he initially thought was interference, but it was too rhythmic to be static. He described it as metal slamming shut, followed by 2 distinct yells, male, sharp, close to the mic. It had come from the northern range, the area closest to Cliffhaven. The log was recorded automatically onto a drive unit and indexed under timecode 0:12 a.m. The next day, Lucas flagged it, along with 3 adjacent files, and included a written note suggesting further review. He didn't hear back for nearly 3 weeks. When the sheriff's office finally responded and requested the tapes, they arrived to find the critical audio file corrupted, completely unplayable. The file was labeled, time-stamped, but unreadable. The others were intact, but mostly wind and sea noise. When questioned, the station manager claimed the hard drive had suffered water damage from a leak in the ceiling. Lucas insisted there had been no leak. He was removed from his rotation 2 months later. That missing file became a focal point for investigators, even though they had no way to prove what was on it. Sheriff Mathers noted the timing, the same minute Raymond's journal entry was cut off, and had it documented in the case file. He requested a digital forensics team, but recovery attempts failed. The tape was declared unrecoverable. In Ardbridge, word spread faster than facts. Stories began emerging. A tugboat captain said he'd heard what sounded like screaming coming from the cliffs while passing offshore just before 1 a.m., but thought it was gulls until the story hit the paper. A hiker who'd been camping on the eastern ridge claimed she'd seen a flash of orange light over the water around midnight. When pressed, she said it didn't come from a flare. It pulsed once, then vanished. But the most persistent rumor came from a group of teenagers who'd been drinking on the beach the night of the storm. They said the wind that night had dropped so suddenly it was like the sea took a breath, and in that moment one of them swore he heard a scream, not like a cry for help, but something closer to a command, like someone shouting a name. And then silence. Most of these accounts were dismissed. The wind can warp sound, fog bends perception, storm nights always leave behind exaggeration. But one thing investigators couldn't shake was the sheer number of unrelated witnesses, people who hadn't spoken to one another, reporting noises from that stretch of cliff between 11:30 and 1 a.m. And still, there was nothing. No proof, no footprints, no new evidence. Sheriff Mathers grew quiet during this phase of the investigation. He stopped giving press statements. Some in his department said he began visiting the Lighthouse alone, just standing outside, not entering. He kept a copy of the corrupted files label in his desk drawer. In interviews later, he'd say only, "There's a difference between absence and erasure. One you expect. The other makes you ask who's doing the erasing." By February, the search had ended. The case file remained open, but with no new leads, it began to fade into the background. The Coast Guard assigned a temporary beacon to the cliff's edge. The lighthouse stayed dark. But people in Ardbridge remembered the quiet of that night, the stillness that didn't feel natural. And when they talked about Raymond Dalka, they didn't say he drowned or ran or vanished. They said the storm came, but it didn't leave everything behind. It wasn't until months after Raymond Dalka's disappearance that the sheriff's office made a quiet discovery that shifted the entire course of the investigation. During a standard review of archived census records and employment documentation, an irregularity came up. Raymond Dalka hadn't existed before 1981. No tax records, no social history, no childhood. The name appeared out of nowhere, linked to a merchant sailor's certification filed in a coastal registry office in Maine. That filing, dated September 1981, marked the start of his official life. Everything before that point was blank. Sheriff Mathers didn't speak to the press about it. Instead, he assigned one of his investigators, Julia Morrow, to dig deeper. It took months of cross-referencing aliases and seamen's licenses, but eventually she found a match, a different name, listed on a fishing trawler's crew manifest from 1979, Ellis Rayner. Ellis had worked aboard a mid-sized commercial vessel called the Greystone Belle, based out of Halifax. In April of 1980, the trawler caught fire in open water. Of the 6 crew on board, 4 were rescued, 2 died. One of the survivors was Ellis Rayner. Weeks before the fire, one of the deceased, a deckhand named Cole Bannon, had filed a complaint with the harbor master, accusing Ellis of deliberately overloading the fuel tanks during a routine refit. No formal charges were filed, and Ellis denied the accusation. But the report never disappeared. It lingered like static in the margins. 3 months after the incident, Ellis vanished. No known address, no exit paperwork. He was presumed to have returned inland or found new work under the radar. But in 1981, a man matching his description applied for maritime certification under the name Raymond Dalka. The photo was grainy. The signature, awkwardly neat. Same height, same scar over the left brow. Julia brought the file to Mathers. Together, they confront the quiet realization that the man who'd watched over Cliff Haven for the past 16 years may have been living under a false identity. It wasn't illegal, not exactly. There had been no warrant, no trial. But it raised a new and uncomfortable question. Had Raymond been running from something or someone? The investigation into the Greystone Belle reignited. Old records were pulled, weather logs, fire reports, survivor statements. One man in particular stood out, the only other crew member from that voyage still alive, Malcolm Hoyt. He had been the ship's engineer and was the last person reported to have spoken to Ellis Rayner after the fire. In one interview from 1980, Malcolm said he didn't think Ellis had set the fire, but that he had the kind of silence that gets people killed. In 2000, Julia managed to track Malcolm to a small fishing town on Prince Edward Island. He lived alone, worked odd jobs, and was known around the docks as quiet but sharp. She contacted him by phone and asked for a statement regarding the Greystone Belle and Ellis Rayner. There was a long pause. Then he asked if the call was being recorded. When she said yes, he hung up. 3 days later, when local authorities visited his trailer to follow up, it was empty. His truck was gone, his freezer unplugged. He was never seen again. It was a strange vanishing, quiet and without explanation. A few receipts suggested he'd recently bought fuel and ferry tickets, but his bank account hadn't been touched since. No relatives filed a missing persons report. No foul play was suspected. He had simply stepped off the map. When Julia presented her findings to Mathers, he asked her to stop digging. Not officially, but quietly, personally. There was a moment between them, later recalled in an internal memo where he said, "If he ran this far to become Raymond, someone helped him disappear, and someone else might have been waiting for him to stop moving." The story never made the press. No mention of Ellis Rayner, no mention of the Greystone Bell or Malcolm Hoyt. Officially, Raymond Dalka remained a missing person, presumed lost at sea. But inside the sheriff's office, the case took on a different texture, not just a vanishing, but a return. Because whatever Raymond had been running from, it may have finally caught up with him, and the question was no longer just where he went, but who had come to find him. By 2003, the Cliffhaven Lighthouse had become less of a mystery and more of a landmark with a shadow over it. The case of Raymond Dalka's disappearance was still officially open, but the active search had long since ended. The beam hadn't lit the coast in nearly 5 years, and with each passing winter, the structure showed deeper signs of decay. Salt ate at the railing bolts, the wooden stairwell warped with humidity. Vandals had left initials in the outer bricks. Still, it stood, and the town council finally approved a partial restoration to preserve what was left. The job fell to a small independent firm hired to assess the building's long-term stability. They weren't crime scene investigators. Their task was structural. Inspect the foundation, identify weak points, catalog restoration priorities. Most of the crew treated it like a typical coastal project. But one technician, Ethan Ford, noticed something strange on the second day. In the lowest level of the tower, a narrow, stone-walled cellar that had once stored oil drums, Ethan found a faint vertical seam in the far wall. It looked like a break in the mortar, just slightly uneven, stretching about 6 feet high. When he tapped the stone beside it with the butt of his flashlight, the sound was dense and solid. But when he knocked directly on the seam itself, the tone changed. Hollow, subtly, but unmistakably. As if there was something behind it, he flagged it in his report and told his supervisor the wall might be hiding an older cavity, maybe part of a drainage channel or an old repair job. But 2 days later, the town pulled funding from the project. The crew was told to suspend all work until further notice. No reason was given. No formal review followed. Ethan filed his notes and moved on to the next job. Later, when interviewed, he said he hadn't thought about it again until the news broke years later. That same summer, before the project was officially suspended, an incident occurred that never made it into any formal report. It started as a dare, a late-night bet between teenagers who had grown up hearing stories about Raymond's disappearance. One of them, 17-year-old Noah Kinley, snuck into the lighthouse through a broken window on the ground floor while his friends waited outside. He was supposed to reach the top and toss a flare from the gallery deck. He never made it past the base. What happened inside was pieced together from Noah's own account, which he gave to police just once, a week later. He said the place felt wrong immediately, too still, not cold, not dark, just heavy, like something was listening. He claimed he only made it halfway down the first stairwell before he heard what he described as a banging pipe, slow, spaced out, rhythmic. At first he thought it was plumbing, some loose valve knocking from wind pressure. But then the sound changed. It became faster, and then something else came with it. He said he heard crying, not loud, not wailing, just muffled. From beneath him, like it was coming up through the stone floor. Noah panicked. He ran, sliced his arm on the broken window frame, climbing back out. His friends saw the blood and thought he was hurt worse than he was. Police were called, a statement was taken, and for a moment, it felt like something real had cracked through the silence surrounding Cliffhaven. But then Noah recanted, said he'd made it up, that he'd tripped and scared himself, that it was a stupid prank that got out of hand. When pressed, he wouldn't repeat what he'd said the first time. He didn't want to talk about the sound. He stopped going to school, refused to walk anywhere near the cliff. A few months later, his family moved inland without notice. Sheriff Mathers never officially reopened the case, but one officer, who had been with him during the original investigation, said Mathers showed up at the lighthouse the next morning after Noah's statement. I stood outside for over an hour. Didn't bring his notebook, didn't ask for keys. He just stood there, staring at the rusted door, saying nothing. The report about the seam in the wall and the teen's story were never linked publicly. No one connected the two events at the time. And by the following year, the lighthouse was fully closed off. Restoration funding dried up, the entrance was welded shut. But for those who'd spent enough time near it, the story never truly went quiet. Because every few years someone, a hiker, a surveyor, a local fisherman, would claim to hear something on still nights when the tide was low. A slow metallic clank like a hinge straining in the wind. Or a sound that didn't belong to waves or gulls, a sound that always seemed to come from under the floor. By the summer of 2023, Raymond Dalka was no longer a name people in Ardbridge remembered. Not unless they were older or had worked search and rescue in the late 90s. The lighthouse still stood, but it had become more folklore than fact. A silhouette at the edge of the cliffs, used by tourists for drone shots and teenagers for dares. Some said it was cursed, some said it was hollow. But no one said it was dangerous anymore. The mystery had thinned with time, diluted by newer headlines, colder winters, and the silence of 25 years. That same year, a heritage grant was quietly approved to restore the Cliffhaven Lighthouse. The local historical society had lobbied for it for over a decade, citing maritime preservation and coastal education programs. There was no mention of Raymond in the proposal. His case was considered unrelated to the structural integrity of the tower. The past was the past. The focus now was future use. The team hired was different from the one in 2003. This time, the budget was held. A full-scale structural survey was ordered, and a team of engineers, architects, and contractors arrived that August. Most of them hadn't heard the story. Those who had didn't bring it up. On their third day of assessment, 2 workers reviewing the original construction schematics flagged a mismatch. The oldest blueprint, dated 1896, showed a small rectangular service chamber built behind the main oil storage wall in the base of the lighthouse, likely a coal-fed ventilation shaft or maintenance corridor. But every tour map, floor plan, and registry diagram since the 1950s had excluded it. Even the 2003 renovation crew hadn't noticed it. The space wasn't large, maybe 6 feet wide by 9 feet deep, but it was marked with solid lines, suggesting it had once been a sealed structure. The wall that bordered it had been reinforced with poured concrete newer than the rest of the foundation. No access door. No hinges, no vent. At first, the engineers assumed the room had collapsed or been repurposed decades ago. But when they began exploratory demolition around the base wall, they found the structure still intact. Beneath layers of paint, the outline of an original doorframe was discovered, and just above it, 2 iron bolts sunk deep into the frame, fused by rust. The concrete around them had hairline cracks, as if pressure had once been applied from the inside. On the 6th day, as demolition continued, a strange odor began to bleed through the stone. One worker described it as metallic. Another said it was bitter, not like rot, but like old water and iron. A third said it smelled like something forgotten. The lead supervisor ordered the work paused and contacted the preservation board, requesting clearance for forensic inspection. Word began to spread around town. A room that wasn't supposed to exist, a wall that had been deliberately filled, a smell that had no name. Sheriff Mathers was long retired, but when he heard the news, he came to the site without being asked. He didn't speak to the crew. He didn't go inside. He stood at the edge of the perimeter tape and looked at the foundation like he was waiting for something to emerge. Later that night, a town council member quietly called one of the original deputies from the 1998 search. Her voice, caught in the meeting transcript, was calm but steady. It's under the floor. It always was. When the concrete seal was finally breached the next morning, the room behind it had no air movement, no light, no sound, just the cold release of pressure and a smell that hit like a warning. They hadn't found answers yet, but the silence was over. And inside that room, that unlisted sealed chamber buried behind 60 years of concrete, something had been waiting. When the seal finally gave way, the air that escaped was thick and unmoving, stagnant in a way that only time can make it. The room behind the wall wasn't large. It was barely the size of a walk-in closet, with low stone walls and a slanted ceiling darkened by age. The light from the portable work lamp revealed little at first. A rust-streaked cot frame, the collapsed shell of a metal stool, and fragments of torn cloth scattered across the ground. The floor was layered in dust, fine as ash, and beneath it, outlines of objects too decayed to name. They had uncovered a sealed chamber, no vents, no secondary exit. And near the back corner, partially slumped against the wall, was what stopped the crew cold. A human skeleton, seated, upright, arms resting loosely in its lap, legs angled as if they had once been crossed but had fallen open over time. The bones were discolored from decades of airless decay, but still clearly intact. A faded, decaying uniform, Lighthouse issued, clung to what was left of the body. On the collar, barely visible through the grime, was a rusted name tag. Raymond Dalka. The discovery was reported immediately. The site was shut down. Forensics arrived from the state office the next morning. Photographs were taken, measurements, everything bagged, tagged, and recorded. The air inside the chamber was analyzed for trace chemicals. The team found remnants of a metal toolbox, its lid warped and corroded. Inside were tools, screwdrivers, pliers, a cracked headlamp, and what looked like a lockpick, rusted nearly to powder. A faded piece of canvas cloth was crumpled beside it, the kind used to carry wrenches. Several buttons and a metal compass were also found nearby. The compass had Raymond's initials carved into the underside. But it wasn't just the presence of his remains that stunned the investigators. It was the lock. The inside of the chamber door, the one they'd broken through, had no knob, no latch, no means of opening it. The locking mechanism had been installed from the outside and reinforced with thick iron bolts driven into stone. Whoever had sealed that room had done so with purpose. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a collapse. It was a cell. Raymond Dalka had been entombed. Forensics estimated the death occurred sometime within 10 to 14 days of the initial sealing. There were scratch marks on the inside of the door frame, 14 in total. One for each day? They weren't deep, just faint grooves left by fingernails or metal. A small chunk of stone had been broken near the bottom corner of the wall. It looked like someone had tried and failed to pry their way out. But there was no sign of blunt trauma, no weapon, no rope, no gag, no restraints, nothing violent. It was slow, silent, a disappearance reclassified as a burial. Dental records confirmed what most already suspected: the remains belonged to Raymond. His bones bore no anomalies. His teeth had a small gold filling that matched his old medical file from 1992. What was left of his boot sole matched the prints found inside the tower in 1998. His coat was still folded beneath him, and yet the questions didn't end with the body. They started there. Because to seal someone in, you needed access, timing, and knowledge. Someone had locked that chamber from the outside and walked away, knowing Raymond was inside. And they had done it without leaving a trace behind. There had been no forced entry in 1998, no sign of struggle. No one reported strange visitors to the Lighthouse. No one had seen Raymond outside town in the days before the disappearance. But now, the reality was unavoidable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an act of nature. Someone had waited for the right moment, lured or forced Raymond into that space, locked the door, and left him to die. The weight of that truth spread fast. Local newspapers picked it up within 48 hours. Headlines shifted from "Discovery at Cliff Haven" to "Murder in the Tower." But for those who remembered the case, it was personal. Because for 25 years, people had speculated about the storm, the scream, the sound beneath the floor. And now, the answer was simpler and darker than they'd ever imagined. Raymond hadn't vanished. He'd been right there, all along, just feet away, alive for days, maybe longer. The discovery sent a shock through the town, but it wasn't grief that filled the air. It was guilt, because the light had gone dark and they'd moved on, because people had whispered stories, made jokes, passed around theories, while the truth sat behind a wall of concrete. A man, alone, waiting. And now that he'd been found, one final question hung in the air. Who sealed the door and why? Forensic teams arrived in waves, staggered by jurisdiction and specialties. Over the course of 3 weeks, the sealed chamber was mapped, catalogued, and dissected piece by piece. Every bolt was measured, every fiber scraped. They treated it less like a room and more like a preserved crime scene, suspended in silence for 25 years. The goal was simple. Reconstruct not just how Raymond Dalka died, but how long he had stayed alive after the door closed. The findings were disturbing. Oxygen readings within the sealed space, combined with the chamber's known dimensions and the decomposition rate of organic matter, suggested that Raymond could have remained alive for up to 10 days, possibly longer, depending on exertion and ventilation loss. The small breaks in the wall's mortar likely allowed minimal airflow. Not enough to sustain indefinitely, but enough to stretch his final days into something slower, harder. On the interior wall, just to the left of where the toolbox was recovered, were scratch marks. 17, faint but deliberate. They aligned roughly with days, short lines stacked beside each other in sets of 5. No words, no message, just marks. Simple, silent documentation. He had kept count, at least for a while. The toolbox itself became the turning point. Though corroded, the tools inside still held partial ridge detail. Latex glove teams performed chemical lift analysis and were able to extract partial prints off 2 screwdrivers and the handle of a rusted wrench. Of the 5 partials pulled, 3 matched Raymond's own. A fingerprint card from a 1981 Siemens license confirmed it. The others, however, didn't belong to him. One of them matched a file in the Department of Defense's archives, a long-closed personnel record from the U.S. Coast Guard. The name on it was Malcolm Hoyt, the same man who had served alongside Raymond, then known as Ellis Rayner, on the Greystone Belle, the same man who had survived the fire at sea in 1980, the same man who refused to speak when contacted in 2000, who vanished 2 days later without explanation, and who, according to a death certificate filed in Prince Edward Island, died in 2009 of a heart attack. Buried with military honors, no family listed. His fingerprint had been inside the toolbox that sat beside Raymond Dalka's body. It didn't take long for the narrative to coalesce. Investigators re-examined the Greystone Belle's incident file. 2 men died in that fire. One of them, Cole Bannon, had filed a complaint against Ellis, accusing him of sabotage over fuel lines just weeks before the explosion. Hoyt, the engineer, had sided with Bannon. When the ship burned and Bannon died, only Hoyt and Ellis survived. But Ellis, or Raymond, disappeared within months. Changed his name. I took a new job and eventually settled at the Lighthouse. Hoyt had spent the next 2 decades off radar, moving jobs, retiring quietly. No evidence of contact, no record of threats. But the discovery of his fingerprint inside that chamber reframed everything. He had been there, not just once, likely twice, once to gain access to the service chamber and again to seal it. He knew the structure of the lighthouse. He served as Coast Guard in the region in the early 90s. He would have had knowledge of the schematics and the authority to move unnoticed. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't impulsive. It had been planned, a quiet, surgical form of revenge. There was no evidence that Raymond had expected it, no written message, no signs of a struggle before confinement. Investigators believed he may have been lured into the room, perhaps under the pretense of maintenance or inspection. Once inside, the door would have shut quickly. The lock is secured. The tools left behind, not as mercy, but as mockery. The picks, the wrenches, none of them would have worked on the exterior sealed bolts. In the end, Raymond had likely realized who had done it, but not how. Not how someone from a fire 23 years earlier had followed him through a new identity, into a new life, and waited until he'd stopped running. Authorities debated whether to release the findings publicly. Sheriff Mathers, in a brief televised statement, called it an act of deliberate and long-planned retaliation, the most carefully concealed murder in county history. Malcolm Hoyt was never charged, never questioned. He was buried 13 years before the truth emerged. Whatever reasons, he had died with him. But what lingered most weren't the facts. It was the silence. The unbroken chain of years where Raymond had been just feet from the outside world, unseen, unheard, forgotten. They had heard stories about the scream, The banging pipes, the sound under the floor. And now they knew what the walls had heard. Not ghosts, no echoes, just a man trying to be found. The room had already given up its greatest secret, Raymond Dalka's remains, the tools, the fingerprints, the iron bolts on the outside of a door that was never meant to open again. But just when investigators thought there was nothing left to recover, one final item emerged, almost by accident. While clearing the debris near the far wall of the chamber, a technician noticed something wedged inside the hollow of a decayed boot heel. The leather had partially collapsed under the weight of time, but hidden deep within it, tightly rolled and wrapped in wax paper, was a page torn from a journal. The ink had held. Not perfectly, but enough. A forensic analyst later said it had survived because of the layer of boot polish on the paper, oil-based, enough to keep the moisture from seeping in. Whatever the reason, it had endured when everything else hadn't. Raymond had written it during the final days of his confinement. There was no date, no heading, just 5 paragraphs written in a tight, slanted hand. The tone was not panicked, not even angry, but weary. It read like someone who had accepted something long before it happened. He began by describing the moment he realized the door wasn't going to open again. He wrote about checking the walls, pacing the floor, trying the bolts from inside, even though he already knew they wouldn't move. He described counting the hours at first, then losing track of time completely once the light under the door disappeared. The second paragraph shifted. He wrote about the sounds, not just the occasional settling of stone or creak of cold metal, but footsteps, faint ones above him, moving slowly across the wooden floorboards of the level above. He said they came at night, and with them sometimes a voice. He didn't name the voice. He didn't need to. I hear it call my name, not loud, just enough to make me think it's real. I know who it is. I think he wants me to answer. But I won't. He didn't explain why he wouldn't, only that he didn't believe it was meant to be a conversation. He believed it was a sentence. The third paragraph was shorter. Raymond wrote that he had once tried to pray, not for rescue, but for clarity, to understand whether he was being punished for what happened on the bell, for running, for starting over under a name that didn't belong to him. He admitted, for the first and only time, that he'd lied, that he had walked away from the fire and let the story reshape itself, that he thought time could soften what he did. But it hadn't. Then came the line investigators would quote most often in the weeks that followed. I know who you are. I deserve this. But the sea never gave you permission. The fourth paragraph trailed longer, almost rambling. He wrote about the lamp at Cliffhaven, about how, in all his years there, he never once missed a lighting, even in storms, even when the tower trembled. It was the one thing he could still control, the one constant. He described it like a duty he clung to, not just for safety, but for penance, a way to shine a light that might undo, in small pieces, the darkness he'd carried with him. And then, the last line. Scrawled harder than the rest, the pen stroke slightly jagged where the ink had caught on uneven paper. Light must always shine. I failed. That was it. No farewell. No explanation. No plea for forgiveness. Just a sentence. One that spoke more to who Raymond was than anything his neighbors had ever guessed. Not a man who ran, but one who watched himself fade. The note was authenticated, preserved, and added to the official file. It never reached the public in full. Only excerpts were released, but those who read it in its entirety said it didn't read like a confession or an apology. It read like a reckoning. A final account from a man who had already accepted that the walls would never open again, and who, in the silence of that sealed room, tried one last time to name what he had done and what had been done to him. It wasn't just the words that stayed with the investigators. It was the way he'd chosen to leave them, not on the desk, not near the door, but inside the boot he always wore, folded, hidden, as if even at the end he wasn't sure anyone would want to hear what he had to say. But they did. And what they heard was not just a man waiting to be found, but one who finally understood why no one had come. By the end of the year, the final report was released. After months of forensic analysis, structural examination, and reopened historical files, the death of Raymond Dalka was officially classified as homicide by entombment, a legal term as rare as the crime itself. There had been no confession, no arrest, no courtroom. But there was enough: a sealed chamber, a fingerprint from a dead man, and a motive buried 25 years deep in smoke and salt water. The investigators wrote it plainly. The man who locked Raymond in had done so with deliberate intent. He knew the layout of the lighthouse, he had come prepared, and he had chosen a punishment meant not to be seen, a sentence that matched what he believed Raymond had escaped on the Bell. No violence, no blood, just time, silence, and a wall that no one would question for a generation. They didn't name Malcolm Hoyt publicly. He was long dead. No surviving family. No military honors to revoke. Just a fingerprint and a context that painted him clearly enough. Those who knew the full story accepted what couldn't be proven in court: that Hoyt had waited nearly 2 decades, watched Raymond reinvent himself, and delivered a justice that no legal system had ever sought: quiet, permanent. The service chamber where Raymond's remains were found was not reconstructed. The Historical Preservation Board ruled unanimously to leave it untouched, not as a tourist attraction, not as a morbid exhibit, but as a tomb. The bolts were resealed, the door repoured, the room was returned to silence, and a small brass plaque was mounted on the wall outside. It read, "In memory of Raymond Dalka, Lightkeeper, 1982-1998. May silence never fall so heavy again." The lighthouse, now fully restored, resumed operation by the fall of 2024. A new automated lantern was installed, the exterior was repainted, tours were resumed on a limited basis, but the lower levels remained off limits. Most visitors never knew what had been uncovered, and the ones who did rarely spoke of it. Inside the sheriff's office, the case file was boxed and archived. Sheriff Mathers, who had watched the case unfold over half his career, retired quietly a few months after the report went public. He never gave a full interview, but in a rare private conversation with one of the state investigators, he reportedly said, "We all thought he ran, that he left the light cold, but he didn't. He was the last one to keep it burning." And that was the part that stayed with people most, not just the crime, not the mystery, but the detail from Raymond's final message, the one where he said he never missed a lighting, not once, that even in storms he made sure the beam reached the water. Then, for 16 years, he showed up, alone, without fail, not for praise, not for penance, just because he believed the light should always shine, even when he couldn't. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, that the place he kept lit for others became the place where no one came for him. That the man thought to have abandoned his post had, in fact, never left it. Locals began calling it the keeper's silence, a phrase that grew beyond the case. It came to mean the quiet that settles over a place after something terrible has happened, the hush of unresolved guilt, the weight of time when the truth arrives too late to change anything. There was no ceremony held for Raymond, no family to stand for him, no one to speak to. But one of the restoration workers, the same one who had found the journal page inside his boot, left a candle on the ledge outside the lantern room one night after his shift. No one noticed until the following morning, when a photo surfaced online, a single white flame against the glass, burning in the highest room. The caption simply read, "For the man who kept the light." They don't allow candles in the lighthouse anymore. Fire hazard. But every few weeks someone leaves one outside the gate. Sometimes it's lit, sometimes it's not. No one knows who does it. No one's ever been seen. But the tradition holds. And today, if you stand at the base of the Cliff Haven Lighthouse, looking up, you'll see the new beam stretch out across the sea. Cold, mechanical, unwavering, it blinks every 8 seconds, just like it used to. But if you look closely at the very top, at the highest chamber, the one Raymond once kept spotless, you'll notice it's empty. Stripped clean, no desk, no chair, no coat rack, just the lamp and the glass. Because when the tower was restored, the team made a decision, unanimous, quiet, undocumented. They left the room vacant. It was never written down. It wasn't part of any regulation. But they said it felt right, that some rooms shouldn't be filled again, that some silences don't need to be broken, and that the last man to sit in that room had already done more than enough.